That came out of nowhere. After what would have been a shadow drop had it not been leaked one day in advance, Kirby Fighters 2 is a thing that exists. Like its predecessor, it's a simpler take on the platform fighter subgenre, promising to be a blast to play when you have 4 people in the same room, or the same online chat room because, you know. So far, it looks to be a fun, casual experience that anyone can pick up and play, not unlike Kirby's mainline titles. Which is why now we're going to take it way too seriously. You can't have a new fighting game without people wondering how every character measures up to each other, so let's make a tier list. Fair warning, these are mostly just personal opinions, so if you disagree with some of them, that's pretty normal. I'll be taking early discoveries and strategies into account, but I won't be solely relying on them, since everything is still new and we don't know how the metagame will develop, if there'll even be a long-term player base to develop one. I'll mostly be looking at each ability's moveset and how well they function overall. With that established, let's begin. Well, gotta start somewhere, in this case from the bottom up. Let's cover the low tier abilities first, starting with a clear candidate for worst in the game. Oh boy, where to begin? Having 2 command grabs is kinda nice. Guarding is a common emergency tactic, so having multiple ways to beat those can help, which is one reason why grappler movesets tend to be so dreaded in fighting games. And one of them is even a burst option that covers a lot of distance. Problem is, that only means so much when both command grabs are so flawed. Rocket Horn goes a long way, but it has so much startup that any opponent paying attention has enough time to react and avoid it. Catching Horn only works at point blank range, making it just an alternative to the default grab everyone has, when you can't even follow up easily because Beetle's throws have so much lag, which is a problem because the rest of the moveset is pretty sparse. With a jab that does okay damage, an uppercut with inconsistent multi-hits, and a ground pound that's also very telegraphed, there isn't much to write home about here. You can't even do the fancy air bullet combo extensions that are still being looked into. Overall, Beetle ability is just disappointing in basically every aspect, relegating it to be this game's cellar dweller. Alas. Next, we have an ability with a moveset too clunky and flawed for its own good. On paper, Bell has some scary high burst damage, with its neutral ring-ding-dong combo dealing up to 80 damage without any extra effort required, off the equivalent of a jab. Anyone getting jab power dunk vibes from this? Except this conversion has one big problem. It's particularly easy to sneak out of using directional influence. Yes, DI is a thing in this game, and it can get opponents out of the combo before you can even land the finisher at its earliest possible point. Having your main combo lose over half its damage output against good players is a big deal when the rest of the moveset involves big yet awkwardly laggy attacks and an inconsistent projectile. But that's not even the worst part. Due to the unique counter properties of Bell's guard, this moveset can't perform dodges. Losing an entire set of defensive options is a major downside when everyone has at least one grab to beat guards, and it makes this ability woefully easy to trap. Despite looking scary at first glance, Bell is dragged down by too many flaws within its moveset, so here it sits. Man, how come almost all the newer abilities ended up down here? To its credit, Artist ability has some pretty effective grounded zoning with its drawings, especially if you get the big Kirby, and if you manage to land a setup hit with a sculpture, it can rack up damage frighteningly well. But in practice, getting these setups going is no easy task. You need a lot of breathing room to start a chain of drawings, and again, they only cover the ground, and you need a lot of prep for a sculpture and an opportunity to hit someone with it since you can barely move while you're holding one. You pretty much need a teammate's help to truly utilize this ability, which means good luck if you're playing a singles match. And that's on top of both the drawings and sculptures having randomized hitboxes and effects, which means that more often than not, you're forced to rely on the rest of the moveset, which is just 3 different slow brush attacks. Artist has some interesting stuff on offer, but so much of it leans so hard on moves that are difficult to use mid-match that it just ends up impractical to fight with. You have no idea how much it hurts to put this one here. Hammer is one of my favorite abilities in the entire series, but stick it in a PvP environment and its downsides get very apparent. I should mention that its damage per hit is very good, so if you can connect with it consistently or even trade blows with an opponent, you'll generally be pretty well off. But that becomes easier said than done with how sluggish most of Hammer's attacks are. The notable pause before most of the swings makes them harder to hit consistently than they've ever been against computer-controlled enemies or bosses in the mainline games. And you can forget about landing Hammer Flip, that thing's about as reliable as a Falcon Punch with less potential to score a knockout. Between these frame data issues, the lack of a projectile, and the moveset's only burst option and hammer swing not actually covering much ground or moving very quickly compared to other moves of its type, you have a clear candidate for the worst neutral in the game. Despite packing such a punch, Hammer struggles so much to get going against competent opponents that it's stuck down here, unfortunately. Next, we have a borderline tier between low and mid, and its sole inhabitant is someone very familiar. Not content to let Kirby hog all the fun, the King has entered the ring. With a similar setup to his Dream Friend moveset and Star Allies, King DDD boasts what is basically a more complete version of the Hammer moveset. Combining the moves the ability already has with a few of his own attacks, and one move Hammer usually has but doesn't here, gives him some versatility that the base ability so sorely lacks. This has the added benefit of giving him a much better game plan in neutral situations, as he's actually able to threaten from a distance. Hammer Throw works as a long-range projectile to encourage opponents to come to him, and his signature face plant has so much movement and shockingly fast startup that it works as a legitimate burst option. He even has more range with his hammer than Kirby does. This all sounds like a substantial upgrade, right? So why is he still this far down? Well, DDD also happens to be a very big target, with easily the biggest hurt box in the game. Even starting with slightly more health than everyone else only helps so much when he's getting hit by things no other character in this game would. But it's still a net improvement from Kirby's take on Hammer, so DDD has a sub-tier all to himself. And with that, we've reached mid-tier. The abilities herein are okay. Not amazing, but also not bad. And the first of them is... one of the poster abilities for Kirby Fighters 2 is also one of its most meh. With a pretty well-rounded moveset overall, Sword ability can do a lot of different things and adapt to many different situations. With decent disjointed spacing, burst options, a spin attack for reads, some solid conversions, and a projectile, it's got just about everything a balanced moveset could want. There's a handful of built-in combo setups as well, from its basic rapid jab to the more intricate drill stab to upward slash to sword dive, especially helpful when drill stab goes so far and you can cancel it on hit. But while Sword is a jack of all trades, it's also a master of none. While there's a lot it can do, most of it is underwhelming compared to more effective abilities. Its combos are less of a threat when, from my experience, its damage output is pretty mediocre, and its projectile requires prior setup and is only really useful for helping you approach. While not a bad moveset by any means, Sword ability just doesn't quite measure up to the stronger ones. This will be a recurring thing in mid-tier. Here we have an early candidate for most annoying ability to fight against, but only as long as it can stay in control. As you'd expect from the name, Archer ability is the king of harassing opponents from far away, able to fire off arrows at surprisingly fast rates, especially if you use Hitman and send them along the ground. Its long-range zoning is something to be feared, especially since a knocked arrow can also be aimed higher or lower before it's let go, allowing you to react to aerial approaches with ease. If you can keep people walled out, especially with the help of a teammate, this one can be a pain to fight against. But that's if you can keep them out, because as you'd also expect, Archer becomes increasingly more vulnerable the closer opponents get. With narrow hitboxes on most attacks and only one melee attack, which requires you to be running first, its options in close combat are completely inadequate, on top of having one of the worst disadvantage states in the game. If you're going to use Archer, then whatever you do not let anyone get up in your face. On to our next non-Kirby fighter, and our first example of one who can zone without projectiles, though he does still have one. Using the disjointed strikes from his spear, and oh boy did they give him some range on it, Bandana D controls mid-range and demands opponents respect his space lest they get poked full of holes. With multiple stabs that work at multiple angles, he's got some options to work with here that make it hard for close-range brawlers to get in. As for the aforementioned projectile, while Spear Throw is kind of awkward at actually zoning, it's not like he needs it to be, because it's more competent at forcing approaches so your main tools can go to work. The downside here? Well, a lot of Bandana D's moveset has a lot of follow-through on it this time around. Most of his attacks are pretty vulnerable if they don't hit, meaning abilities, or opponents, that excel at punishing whiffed attacks can turn the tides on you. Playing as Bandana D entails understanding your move's limits and knowing how to control space without overextending. Here's a weird one. Bomb ability is Kirby Fighters 2's premier trapper moveset, flinging bombs around at various angles and velocities to put opponents in situations where they can't avoid getting blown up. Between tossing bombs in different ways, rolling them at different heights, or even setting them down in different positions, there are all kinds of setups you can do here, especially once you realize a dropped bomb can basically be remotely detonated by placing a second one. The versatility of bomb ability's set play can make it very difficult to approach against in the hands of a player who uses the moveset to its fullest. Ever fought a good snake? It's kinda like that. Well, that's only half true, because Bomb sorely wishes it had some threatening CQC options, or any kind of CQC. This moveset needs its space to function effectively, as its only real option up close is its bomb drop command grab, or to set a bomb down in front of you and hope it works. If you take this ability for a spin, you absolutely want to think ahead constantly and ensure those close quarters situations happen as rarely as possible. Shoring up the mid-tiers is a very refreshing ability. One of Water's hidden upsides is the fact that it doesn't have a traditional run animation. Generating waves to surf on anytime you need to get around means it's got faster grounded movement than any other ability, complete with an active hitbox on the wave itself. Add that to the big, far-reaching wave surf dash attack, it makes this moveset quite the effective zone breaker. In fact, Water in general has a lot of big hitboxes for beating out opposing attacks, while also still possessing some decent combo potential. Wave surf to Rainbow Rain is a staple conversion, and Geyser can snare opponents for multiple hits if you mash to make the hat spray water even higher. That said, Water has some notable blind spots that hold back its ability to outspace its way to wins. A serious lack of answers to diagonal attacks limits its neutral. Short of jumping and spitting water to cover low diagonals, even that just functions as a worse version of Pikachu's Thunder Jolt. This leads to the kit overall feeling just a little incomplete and keeps it from rising out of mid-tier. For now. Next, we have another tier in between, featuring abilities too good to be called mid-tier, but not quite high-tier. This one's more occupied than its counterpart was. Oh, what a horrible night to... Wait a minute, wrong series. Our second disjoint zoner moveset, Whip ability focuses on controlling mid-range in similar fashion to Bandana D, which it does quite competently both on the ground and in the air, thanks to whip cracks in multiple directions, multiple rapid attacks, a rising multi-hit anti-air, and even a mid-air diagonal strike eerily similar to how the Belmonts can angle their aerials downward in Ultimate. This moveset also offers an unusually versatile command grab, able to come out straight ahead or above you with remarkable range. You can even charge it in midair, something no command grab we've seen so far can do. Allows for some sneaky mix-ups and such. However, Whip ability does have issues doing its best stuff consistently, from little problems like the rapid attacks having opponents fall out sometimes, to the aforementioned command grab having to be charged and therefore only working well as a mix-up. This ability always has to worry about something not working as planned. Still, it's effective enough to be worth taking a crack at. Just whatever you do, don't forget the hat. Victory is his destiny. And in playable form, Meta Knight's swordplay lets him hold his own even when he doesn't have DDD backing him up. While he can't use most of the moves he throws at you as a boss, Meta Knight does still come with an enhanced version of the sword moveset with additional attacks, much like DDD has a more complete version of Hammer. Basically, the only real upside Kirby's take on sword has is access to air bullet extensions. With additional moves such as up thrust and shuttle loop, Meta Knight has extra options to attack with and combo routes that Kirby can't pull off, allowing him more versatility in different situations and letting him convert more damage off stray hits more often. That said, this is still a sword moveset, and with that comes the same flaws. Meta Knight's damage per hit is still pretty meh, he still risks losing trades against more powerful attacks, and his only projectile is still just a fallback option. What you see here is what you get, a more advanced version of sword with more upsides but still the same weak points. Oh boy, is this one ever a pain to deal with once it gets going. With a mix of projectiles and disjoints, Beam ability is a zoner moveset with annoyingly good mid-range control. Using Beam Whip and Psycho Beam to space at arm's length on the ground, Wave Beam to fire off a strong projectile, and Beam Blast to harass opponents from the air, it's got all kinds of ways to keep opponents out. Though what sets it apart is how seamless its pressure can get once it has momentum, with Beam Whip in particular being nearly spammable if an opponent has no answer to it from its maximum range. It even has a glitch that lets it deal more damage than usual if it hits more than one target at a time. But, just like Archer and Bomb before it, Beam is very vulnerable if an opponent gets in and wins neutral before getting locked down. All it can throw out in midair if it didn't just jump out of a dash is Beam Whip, which takes forever to actually hit below. But if you can't avoid losing neutral very often, you have a very effective moveset on your hands. We're getting into the big boys now. High tier features some very powerful abilities, though still with downsides that can still be exploited. And fittingly, our first is... Of course the one designed as a walking shout out to Street Fighter would feel right at home in a fighting game. Boasting the most extensive moveset of the entire roster, Fighter ability has more options at its fingertips than any other. With quick strikes, slower but stronger blows, projectiles, burst options, a command grab, and the obligatory Dragon Punch uppercut, this moveset is a jack of all trades in typical Shoto fashion that doesn't sacrifice much effectiveness the way Sword does. Thanks to its unique ability to cancel many of its moves immediately into others, Fighter also boasts extensive built-in combo routes that other abilities could only dream of, ensuring even your simplest attacks have a chance to convert into big damage. But not all is perfect here, since so much of its effectiveness is tied to its light/heavy attacks, cancels, and a command input for instant mid-power fireballs. Fighter has the steepest learning curve in the game, and even then, it's still outmatched by several other abilities. But don't let that stop you from taking this pint-sized World Warrior for a spin, especially if you have a background in traditional fighters. Stepping out of the shadows is our next high tier. Ninja ability is exceptionally well-rounded in its own way, effective in combat in varying ranges and situations. It's very difficult to get the drop on a skilled ninja after all. But even if you can get the upper hand, this moveset also boasts some useful defensive options, using Blossom Storm as a movement mix-up and fake-out, or Clone Technique as an outright counterattack. If you're facing a ninja player, you can never afford to let your guard down lest you get the tables turned back against you. Or, take a blade to the face for some nasty damage. But despite all this, Ninja does have one downside. Its throwing knives aren't actually zoning tools, because they don't deal any knockback. While they can force close-range specialists to approach, enemy zoners can laugh off your kunai attacks uninterrupted and outpace their scratch damage. And when you're the one who has to approach, Ninja's options are more limited than when it's the other way around. But a true ninja knows how to work around such limitations, right? Turns out a weapon as unassuming as a child's toy can be very dangerous in the right hands, though that's pretty normal for Kirby, isn't it? The next highest disjoint-based moveset on the list, Yo-Yo offers great mid-range control with more complete coverage than its counterparts. The fact that you swing it in an arc lets you hit spots that Whip or Bandanity's spear wouldn't touch so easily. On top of that, this moveset has shockingly low commitment on some of its best options. Did you know you can jump out of Walk the Dog immediately at any point? Or that mashing during break spin lets you go into the air with it to carry opponents or evade punishes. The sheer flexibility gives it a leg up on most other disjoint movesets. Though that doesn't apply to the entire moveset. In fact, the attacks that don't have sneaky tricks like that generally have quite a bit of end lag, making them easy to punish with ranged attacks if they don't connect. So you still have to use them carefully, or these upsides will hardly matter. Speaking of unassuming weapons, bet you didn't expect an umbrella to be this high up. Parasol's upsides are different than most other abilities, offering unique traits both for protecting you and making it easier to approach and play neutral in general. The Parasol's very presence acts as a constant shield against many projectiles depending on where it's currently positioned, letting you answer all those pesky projectile zoners with ease. Which becomes even easier thanks to the far-reaching burst movement of Parasol Drill and Parasol Dive, both of which carry the same protective abilities and block projectiles ahead of you as you move. This actually lets you punish the very act of enemies throwing out certain attacks by charging right through them. Though for all its sheer utility, Parasol does have one downside. It doesn't have that many moves to work with. This makes it rather linear and predictable, despite how useful the moves it does have can be. Strong mind games are key if you're using this ability against a good player. And now, for the strongest of them all. The top tier, the cream of the crop, that which the metagame revolves around, for better or worse. Starting our top 5 in off-kilter fashion, Staff ability sits here because of its sheer anti-meta power and ability to shut down other movesets in neutral. Its utterly ridiculous reach puts other disjoint movesets to shame, bludgeoning opponents from ranges other weapons wish they could match. This thing can even go toe-to-toe with projectile-based movesets without their usual downsides. And it does so while still maintaining the ability to extend and control space in multiple directions based on what you need. Far-reaching pokes, rapid attacks on the ground or in the air, or an extra-long jab that nearly crosses the entire screen all give this moveset unmatched spacing prowess and force opponents to play at your pace and respond to whatever you do rather than the opposite. So what's the catch? Well, this moveset's neutral actually has an Achilles heel. You can duck under its forward attacks, unless you're DDD, which lets you dodge an incoming hit if you're grounded, but only if you're not already doing something. But since this still leaves its ability to answer enemy attacks intact, it's not enough to drag it out of this lofty spot. For now. The new ability on the block had a lot to live up to, but it answered those questions so well it's left players wondering if it really needed to be this overtuned. the other grappler moveset in the game. This one is much more of a threat than the previous, with freakishly fast and far-reaching command grabs that lead into throws more powerful than those of any other moveset. Beetle wishes it had something like these. Not only that, but both the moveset and the context of the game it's a part of lets wrestlers circumvent many of the weaknesses that grapplers usually have in fighting games. Since nearly every version of Kirby has the same stats, its mobility and disadvantage state aren't any worse than most of the cast, and the sheer speed of its grabs makes it better at approaching than several other abilities. But it does still have one downside. True to form, wrestlers' attacks have pretty poor reach overall, meaning you have to get close to get things going. This can lead to being walled out by weapons or projectiles if you can't predict when to go in on them. And now, the strongest regular copy ability in the game. You'd never know it at a glance, especially if you played Superstar with how underwhelming it is there, but Cutter is an utter nightmare to behold in the right hands. The ability to guide the Cutter boomerang up and down after it's been thrown makes this moveset's projectiles shockingly hard to punish, since you can adjust their trajectory at will to match whatever an aggressive opponent does. And if you're fighting a zoner, you can get out of range, toss a charged one in the opposite direction, and guide it through their zoning as it spins back around to overpower them. But Cutter's greatest asset is its burst options, with a dash attack and a dive kick that are lightning fast to come out, deal strong damage, combo into other moves, including both the hard-hitting final Cutter combo and themselves, and have so little end lag that hitting someone's guard with them will sometimes give you a frame advantage. Whether approaching or forcing approaches, Cutter is nearly always in control. Sure, you do need some space to get your projectiles going, which can make mid-range iffy against movesets with more flexible movement, but it's barely an issue for a kit that can steamroll opponents in the blink of an eye. But would you believe there are still two movesets more overpowered than this? This Master of Magic from another world has remained a fan favorite long after his debut, and with a moveset like this, that won't change anytime soon. This game's undisputed king of galaxy brain setups, Magolor has all kinds of ways to control the stage with his disjointed moves and then chain them into each other the moment an opponent slips up. Toss a gem apple bomb into the fray and then snipe someone when they try to avoid it, or confirm it into a dash attack if they don't. Snare a foe in midair with a black hole, and then summon an ultra sword while they're helpless to avoid it. The possibilities are endless. And that's on top of having hands down the best disadvantage state in the game. Stuck in a corner or struggling to land? Just use Dimensional Vanish and teleport somewhere safer. Being able to just bail out when things get bad means Magolor never has to be in a bad spot for long and can get right back to setting up. Sure, he's technically something resembling mortal if you get close, but that's just relatively speaking. He still has a few things he can throw at you, or he might just throw you. Magolor is never truly vulnerable. And yet, there's still someone better. I know what you're thinking. How did this guy end up the best character in the game? Well, it turns out there's a reason why the powers that be kept him out of the action for so long. Warning sign number 1, a moveset that can quite literally do whatever he needs it to. Rapid damage up close, a command grab to beat shields, an anti-air that works no matter where you are, long-range attacks to combat zoners, a burst option to close the distance at mid-range, even stone is an answer to juggle attempts. Other movesets have some or most of these, but GUI can do them all. But that pales in comparison to the utter brokenness that is the Mock Matter Laser, a super fast, infinite range projectile that pierces through enemy attacks, combos into itself and other moves, can be angled up or down, and has so little end lag that you can basically spam it and out-neutral everyone else in the game. So, what's the downside here, you may ask? Good question. I honestly don't know what this guy's weak point is supposed to be. With unmatched versatility, no apparent weakness, and the ability to control the match basically on a whim, GUI reigns supreme atop the tier list. And there you have it. This is where I think every character and copy ability in Kirby Fighters 2 sits compared to each other at this current moment. While I don't know if much of a competitive community will spring up to actually put it to use, hey, it was still fun to make. Should be interesting to see if this game gets any updates going forward to add any more abilities or dream friends. Are there any you're hoping get in if that happens? And what do you think of this list overall? Feel free to give your own thoughts or tell me how stupid and wrong I am in the comments. Special thanks for this video to these people here. Shout out to my patrons for their continued support in these trying times. Though with us finally getting more Smash news, it's a little more bearable for now. And pretty much all everyone's going to be talking about for a while. Hopefully people are still interested in this. Well, however things play out, see you next time.